Thank you, Jake. And thanks to everyone else for joining us on day 2 of HashiConf. Yesterday we talked about a ton of really exciting security-related announcements. And as we said yesterday, today we're going to be talking about a little bit more on the developer side of things instead. So this keynote, I'd like to focus on exploring the developer workflow and how developers interact day to day with applications and some exciting new stuff that we're working around that. So let's start by exploring the application lifecycle and how developers interact with that lifecycle. So here we have sort of a view of the standard steps during the application lifecycle that any application using any technology tends to hit. You start with the coding side, you do some tests, you build, deploy, release, then you operate some infrastructure that it's running on, and you tend to usually measure both the infrastructure and the application to determine everything is working correctly. And if we look at this sort of life cycle of an application, there are certain steps that have really well established tools to use with them, as well as patterns around it. So on the very sort of far left, we have coding and testing. Around this, you have editors like Visual Studio Code. You have, for tests, you have CI environments like Circle. You put your code on GitHub. These are all, pretty much accepted and set in stone solutions that everybody is happy with and is predominantly using across the industry. And if we look on the very right, we see something similar, which is in the operate and measure side of things, there's tools like Terraform, Kubernetes, Nomad, Datadog. These are tools that no matter what application you're working on, no matter what infrastructure you're targeting, these will work for you, and they're used very widely across the industry, so they're very common tools. But if we zoom in here on these middle three, it gets a little more complicated. When we look at build, deploy, and release, there's a lot of tools out there that aim to address these steps, but the challenge is they're usually very technology specific, or there's a lot of fragmentation between communities. And those tend to be related because of the fragmentation. There's a lot of different tools. And so you see some solutions here, but they are a challenge and they're not consistent. So if you learn one set of tools, you tend to have to relearn a totally different set of tools to use a different platform, or to use a different programming language, or to just join a company that has a different sort of cultural approach to this sort of problem. And so build, deploy, and release is where we were seeing a lot of challenges. And to be clear, the problem with these steps isn't where we could deploy applications. Over the past decade or so, we've seen a huge rise in the number of places that we could actually run our applications. We have EC2 VMs still. You could still run VMs. We have container platforms like Kubernetes. We have full platform as a service like Heroku and Netlify and others in that space. And now we also have serverless platforms popping up that are sort of, like Lambda or Google Cloud Run. In this category of where to run applications, there is a wealth of choice that we have, and it's gotten very exciting over the past 10 years of seeing that change happen. The challenge instead is not where, but how we get there. It's the workflow of build, deploy, and release that is extremely fragmented and difficult with these different platforms. So let's take a look, let's make this concrete and take a look at some examples. Starting with build. We'll go through build, deploy, and release. So let's start with build, and let's look at an EC2 example, a Kubernetes example, and a Google Cloud Run example. These are three very popular platforms that you might use today, and they're three different sort of paradigms as well: VMs, containers, and serverless. So taking a look at these three examples, just looking at build alone, you could see the challenge starting to rise here. For each platform, we have a totally different sort of industry accepted tool, community accepted tool that would be used for this phase. For EC2, you might use something like Packer to build the VM image. For Kubernetes, you might use something like Docker to build the container image that is used with Kubernetes. And for Google Cloud Run, you're likely going to use either Docker again directly, or the Google Cloud specific command line interfaces that they've created for Google Cloud Run. And so you could see some fragmentation here, even though in abstract, they're all trying to do the same thing: take some source code from an application, turn it into some artifact that is accepted by the platform. Next, if we look at deploy, very similar. We see Terraform for the VM side, kube control coming in, or Helm for the Kubernetes, part. And then for Google Cloud Run, we're still sort of living in that Google Cloud CLI. And so there's both fragmentation here, and now we're also starting to see where between these steps from build to deploy, we're also seeing the tool itself change. So for VMs, for example, we went from Packer for the build phase to Terraform for the deploy phase. We saw something similar with Kubernetes. We went from Docker for the build phase to kubectl or Helm for the deploy phase. So we're seeing both fragmentation across and between sort of the platforms and the steps. And to bring it back to release, if we look at release, we see the same thing. Where there's some tools that are staying the same, like Terraform, and then there's some changes in the tools that are being used. And across the 3 different paradigms and 3 different platforms, we're seeing different tooling being used. So the challenge is the workflow of build, deploy, release, and the fragmentation and specific tool knowledge that you need to get through those, just using these 3 examples. But remember, there's a dozen or more different really viable platforms that we could be sending our applications to. And so to boil it down into sort of a simple challenge, deploying applications to production just doesn't seem to have gotten much easier. There's a lot of challenge to get your application from code into a deployment platform, even though the choice we have of where to put them has grown wildly. And developers want a better interface to be able to deploy. And so we see some people different organizations attempting different solutions to try to solve this in different ways. And here are 3 examples of how a company today might try to solve this developer interface challenge, developer workflow challenge to get their applications to production. On one side, you have something like makefiles. You might standardize your company, your team, on a set of makefiles or make tasks to use. And this tends to work. The challenge with this is it's very difficult to scale, and there's really no community knowledge or shared knowledge around this practice. Another option might be using CI pipelines, CI/CD pipelines, to encapsulate all of this into sort of hide it behind an interface that might be git push or clicking a button in a CI UI. And this is similar to makefiles in that it tends to be very organization specific, and it's very fragmented between the different CI environments and tools you use as well. And then the last option is a platform as a service. And a platform as a service gives you a great, really clean way to get an application to production. But the challenge is if you sort of exit the boundaries of that platform, you need to do something a little bit too complicated, or you need to talk to an application or interact with an application that isn't in the platform. A lot of these platforms tend to break down or become extremely difficult to use. And we could see that with platforms we had around 10 years ago, as well as the emerging platforms we have today. So they tend to be sort of an all or nothing type thing. And so here are 3 interfaces that have been tried, but we think there might be a better way. And so it boils down to us trying to address the developer need that we believe developers just want to deploy. They want to write their applications and they just want to deploy. No matter what platform it's going to, no matter what technology is in use, we want a common workflow to be able to deploy our applications. So let's take a step back and talk about HashiCorp for a bit and talk about what our experience is with developer interfaces. If we look back across this application lifecycle from code to measure, we've released a lot of software in here. On one side, we have Vagrant, and on the other side, we have tools like Consul and Vault and Nomad, etc. And if we look at our whole portfolio, there is really one tool where we really focus on developer workflow first, and that is in the coding side with Vagrant. With Vagrant, it was from day one a tool to build development environments. We tried to build a workflow to consistently build development environments that was repeatable and shareable. And the way we built this workflow was boiling it all down into a single command, which was Vagrant up. In one command, we took what was prior to Vagrant dozens or many, many more steps of how to set up a developer machine to one command that worked on all major operating systems, Mac, Windows, and Linux. And we did this 10 years ago, and Vagrant has been wildly popular since then. Developers really attached to this workflow. It solved a problem, it made something repeatable, and it worked no matter what programming language you were using, what operating system you were on, how you were deploying your application. Vagrant is one developer interface we made that we felt really hit the mark in what developers were trying to do. So the question is, looking at that experience and based on that experience, can we create a similar type of workflow for application deployment? And we think we can. So prior to announcing this today, we shared what we built with a number of people outside the company, and this is what they had to say about it.
Waypoint is awesome. I would expect nothing less from the team at HashiCorp.
And I think the thing that's most promising about it is codified build, deploy, release cycle. And I'm really hopeful that Waypoint will be able to relieve people from the need to create these custom systems with custom scripts. Depending on the size of your organization, it might even be an entire team. And I'm really excited about the prospect that Waypoint might allow a Terraform-esque community to form around Waypoint in the continuous delivery space.
Hey there, HashiConf. The future of cloud native is developer productivity. And so I'm excited to see innovative tools like Waypoint make it easier for developers to build, release, and deploy their containers out to our services, like Azure Container Instances, our Kubernetes service, or even to the edge with Azure Arc. Congratulations, HashiCorp, on the launch of Waypoint.
As you can see, people seem pretty excited about what we had to show them, and I'm excited to now share that with you today. Today, we're announcing our new project, Waypoint. Waypoint is a new free and open source project available now. Waypoint gives you a consistent workflow to build, deploy, and release your applications on any platform. The way Waypoint works, based on what we learned with other tools, is Waypoint Up. The Waypoint Up command encapsulates the build, deploy, and release phases all in one command to focus on getting your application from development into production. You could see here on this slide that we break down each phase, the build, deploy, and release, into the specific tool that you want to use to make that happen, the platform where you want it to go to, and the logic you want to use to release it to the public. We take each of these configurations and we put it into a single Waypoint configuration file. So seeing this example here, we would put in the build phase, the deploy phase, and the release phase. By putting it all in one file, you could reference this one file to know the full logic and life cycle of how that application gets to production. You could see here that Waypoint isn't trying to replace tools like Helm or Docker or Kubernetes directly. What we're trying to do here is wrap these tools and actually glue them together in the right order and provide a consistent workflow on top of them. So for the build, we're using cloud native build packs here. That's what the pack means in this example file. For deployment, we're using Kubernetes, and for that, we will be creating deployments, services, etc. And for release management, we're also just using Kubernetes native systems, and in this case, we use the Kubernetes service primitives to point to the correct deployment that we want the public to see. And so you could see that we're able to compose these different technologies and give a consistent workflow on top of it. When you run a Waypoint Up, the output looks something like this. You'll see the build, you'll see the output as part of that, you'll see the deploy happening, and then you'll get a release at the end. With the release, you'll get a release URL. The release URL is the public URL that people can visit to see this application. This is provided by the platform. So in the case of Kubernetes here, we're getting an IP address for a load balancer. And below that, you get a deployment URL. And you'll notice that this deployment URL has a waypoint.run domain. This uses a service that we run that is separate from Waypoint in order to provide routable URLs for all your deployments. This is an optional service, but it's really nice because it gives you a URL to every application that you have, no matter what platform it's on, and it's consistent. And Waypoint Up works across any application code to any platform. So it doesn't matter what programming language you're using or where you're deploying it to, Waypoint Up gives you that same consistent workflow, URL output, deployment URLs across any mix of these platforms and programming languages. So you run Waypoint Up. The next question is always, is it running? Any deployment tool you use, you do the deploy, and the next thing you check is if it's actually running. This might just be opening up a URL, refreshing a few times, it might be checking logs. Either way, you just want to make sure the deploy actually worked. And so we think it's important for a tool that does a deploy to also give you those tools necessary to validate that your deployment actually worked. And so with Waypoint, we provide a number of features to validate that the deployment worked. One way to validate your deployments is through our UI. Waypoint has a UI that you could visit in the web browser that shows you a list of all your builds, deploys, releases, and their current status. You could use this to verify that your deployment is actually complete. And you know that we built this for developers because we also have a dark mode. Another tool you could use that we provide is Waypoint Exec. Waypoint Exec is a tool on the command line that you could use to open a shell or execute any process in the context of a deployment. So you could do this to read a file, check logs, debug things. This gives you access to any deployment to make sure that it's up and running. And Waypoint Exec works across any platform you're deploying to. So we know tools like Kubernetes provide a similar exec style functionality on its own, but you can also use Waypoint Exec with Google Cloud Run, EC2 instances, and anything else that Waypoint supports. And it's the same experience across all of those. And so this gives you a great tool to make sure that your deployments are actually working. And another thing you could do is view logs. With Waypoint, you could run Waypoint logs, and as part of that, you could see all of the recent logs from all of your deployments of that application. And again, this works across every platform consistently. So even if one of your platforms provides a log-like capability, you could also get this for every other one that you're using a consistent workflow. And these logs, aren't meant to replace long-term log storage or log searching. These are really just recent, past few days, past few weeks set of logs that you could use to just quickly diagnose any challenges you might be seeing, or just to verify that everything is up and running as you would expect. And those are a few sets of tools that give you the ability to validate that your deployments are actually working, and also to debug issues that might happen later on. The last pillar that's very important for Waypoint is extensibility. We want to make sure that Waypoint can work the way you want to work, as well as work where you want to work. So it's extensible via a plugin interface, and the workflow is flexible to work in a variety of scenarios. Let's take a look at the workflow first. A common way people like to deploy applications is CI/CD. There's other things that you're trying to do as part of deployment that doesn't necessarily fit into a standard build, deploy, release cycle. And so CI/CD is a great way to wrap that up. Waypoint works great with CI/CD. We've provided a number of examples and documentation of how you could run Waypoint directly within your CI/CD platforms. And in doing so, you really simplify that step that's actually deploying your application to be consistent across a variety of different places. Another way people like to work is through a GitOps or Git-based workflow. And usually the way this looks is you would do a Git push, and as part of the Git push, it also triggers a deploy either to production or just a preview. And so with Waypoint, we've both documented and published plugins for different version control systems so that you could integrate this directly into your Git workflows. And so in this screenshot, we show you our GitHub integration. With the GitHub integration, we've made it so that every branch will get a separate build, deploy, release, and a deployment URL that is branch specific. So you could actually see for your branch the preview of that deploy, how it's working, and then when you merge it into your main branch, it'll deploy into production. All of this is super configurable and just an example of what's possible with Waypoint. And there's a variety of other ways people like to work. So we mentioned CI/CD, we mentioned Git. Some people like to trigger deploys via Slack. Some people just like to use a UI. And of course, there's a lot of people that use the terminal, the command line interface, and are comfortable with that. And as you could see through the couple examples we gave, Waypoint is flexible to work in all of these environments. And it's not just flexible to work in those environments, it works across them as well. You could deploy something by clicking in the UI at the same time as someone deploying something using the CLI at the same time that someone is maybe pushing a branch into GitHub and getting a branch-based deployment. Waypoint lets you work the way you want to work or the way that your company or organization wants to work. The next thing is making sure that Waypoint supports all the available systems that you want to orchestrate with it, that it could deploy to the platform you want to, that it builds images the way that you want to build them. And to do that, Waypoint has a fully pluggable, extensible interface. This is a feature of software that you've come to know and love from HashiCorp. We do this with almost everything we build, and Waypoint is no exception. With Waypoint, you could build plugins that are custom builders, custom registries of where these artifacts could be sent to. You could build custom platforms of where the deployments are sent or where the deployments run. And then finally, you could also build plugins to do custom release management. Do you want to do blue-green deployments? Do you want to just deploy right away? You could customize all of this through a plugin interface. And we support almost more than a dozen plugins out of the box, but we expect this to grow significantly as the community jumps in and starts building more plugins. So with Waypoint, I highlighted the 3 important pillars that we built it on. We want to make sure that Waypoint provides a consistency in its workflow. We also want to make sure that as part of that workflow, you have confidence that it worked. We showed that through exec, logs, etc. And then finally, we want it to be extensible and to build an ecosystem. And that's done via our plugin interface and really the flexibility of Waypoint to support all of these different environments. So I've spent a lot of time talking about what Waypoint is and why we built it, but I really just want to dive in and show you how this thing works. So let's do that now. Okay, to start showing you this demo, we're going to show you the context that Waypoint has. Contexts let us talk to different Waypoint servers. And in this case, we have both a local environment that we're running to test our deployments, and then a production environment that we might be sharing across our company. Next, let's look at the Waypoint configuration file for this project. Every project that you have has a Waypoint configuration file. The project is usually maps one-to-one to a Git repository or VCS repository. In this case, we name the project called HashiConf demo, and we have one application that we want to deploy within this project. And to do that, we're going to be using Docker to begin. So you can see the demo here, our app, and then our build and deploy settings. Next, let's take a look at the Docker file that we will be using to build our application. In this case, it's a pretty standard React-based application, so we're going to build the application with React and then serve it using Nginx. The first thing we have to do with all these configuration files is run a Waypoint init. What a Waypoint init does is registers our project with the Waypoint server, but also just validates our configuration, makes sure that we have all the plugins, makes sure that we're authenticated properly, etc. Once the Waypoint init is done, we could run the up. As the up is running, you can see we build the image and show you that output. We do the deploy, and then we do a release. And just to remind you again, this is all happening against Docker, against our local deployment currently. This might be to just test the build, test the deploy, make sure it works. And so once the release is done, we get a URL at the end of it. If we click that URL, we could see it worked. Everything deployed, and it's running. Okay, so everything worked locally. So the next thing we're going to want to do is switch to our production context. Let's deploy this application into production. And just to show that things are changing, we're also going to modify the application, and so you could see that the deployment looks a little bit different. So just going to uncomment some stuff that we have here in our application so it looks a little different. Okay, with that, we're going to also modify the Waypoint configuration. In production, we're not going to be using Docker directly. So we're still going to use Docker to build the image, but we also need to push the image that it builds to a registry so that our deployment platform can reach it. So we're going to use a Docker registry, push to that. And then for the deployment, we're going to use Kubernetes in production. So use that plugin. Kubernetes has slightly different deployment, different configuration. So we're going to do some of that. And we're also going to set up a release manager in this case. And that'll just make sure that we could visit this publicly. We run the init process again. This is done to ensure that we switch servers. So we need to make sure that this project is again registered with the new server. And then we run Waypoint up once again. This case, it'll look a little different. The build looks the same because we're still using Docker, but we're going to see a push happen afterwards. And then we're going to see the deploy and release look different because we're going to Kubernetes this time and not Docker, and they work differently. But at the end of it, we get a release URL, we get a deployment URL, and let's go ahead and look at that. Okay, so it deployed. It looks different because we modified our application, but it's running on Kubernetes and using the exact same configuration, style and the exact same Waypoint up workflow. And just to show the flexibility of Waypoint one more time, we are now going to modify the application because we're going to deploy it to a different platform. We're going to deploy it to a serverless platform this time. So let's modify the application and add in a little bit more so it looks different. We're going to add in this timeline component. And let's change it from a dark theme to a light theme. So it'll definitely look different this time. Next, we're going to modify our Waypoint file again. In this case, we're going to be targeting the Azure Container Service. So let's throw away the Kubernetes configurations and add in the Azure Container configurations. Okay, so we use the Azure Container Instance plugin, and this has a number of different configurations. You can see we need a resource group here, some capacity config. Looks a little bit different, but the workflow will be the same. So with that saved, we can run Waypoint up again. We don't need an init this time because it's the same server that we're using. And then again, the deploy and release will look a little different because we're going to ACI this time and not Kubernetes. But at the end of this, we're going to get, again, 2 URLs out of it, the application URL and the deployment URL. If we open that, we now see our light mode Waypoint website with our timeline component rendered there. And this is now running on ACI. So we showed 3 different deploys, one locally on Docker, one in Kubernetes, and one in ACI. And throughout the whole thing, it required minimal changes and just running Waypoint up again, basically. So we talked about exec and logs, so let's also look at that. If we run Waypoint exec bin sh, we get a shell. This shell is running in ACI. This is a feature that ACI doesn't provide natively. So this is showing how Waypoint could provide features like this that the platform may not support. It's a real shell. We could prove that by, catting our Nginx configuration that we built into our image, and you could see that is there. And we could also take a look at logs. So let's go ahead and run Waypoint logs, and we could see all the various, HTTP request output that we would see because we visited the application. And let's finally look at the UI. So we did all this, we've been working in the terminal this whole time. Let's open up the UI. You could do that really simply with the Waypoint UI command. Since our Mac in this case is in light mode, our UI is also in light mode. And you could see here we have all our builds, all our deploys listed here. You saw some logs you could also see from the UI. The UI just gives you a great way to get an overview of everything that has been happening with this Waypoint server. On the releases page, or on the deployments page, you could also see on the right here that for each deploy, we have that deployment URL. I mentioned earlier in the keynote that every single deploy gets a versioned URL. And so we have v1 and v2 here. They have the same name, the globally communal Fox, because they're the same application, but they get the v1 and v2 because they're different deploys. And what I want to do here is click each of them, because if you remember, one is on Kubernetes and one is on ACI, and yet both deployment URLs work. We deploy to both Kubernetes and ACI. The deployment URLs are roughly the same except for the version, and you can visit both versions of that application. And that's really neat because you could go back in time and see the previous state of your deployments. And at the end of all this, once we're ready to clean up, we could run a Waypoint destroy, Waypoint deployment destroy, and just, destroy all our deployments. And this deletes them and makes them so they are no longer visitable. And that is Waypoint. I'm super excited to be able to have shown you that demo today of Waypoint, but there's so much more in the release that I wasn't able to show you. And this slide talks about some of those things. So we saw build, deploy, release, exec, logs, etc. But there's so many more plugins I wasn't able to show you and other features just listed here today. There's also a lot more that we want to build towards. This is an initial release after all. So we're really excited about where Waypoint is going to go. So today, Waypoint 0.1 is now available. You could find Waypoint at waypointproject.io. Give it a try. We really hope you love it. If you want to learn even more about Waypoint, we have a deep dive session given by Evan Phoenix, who worked directly on Waypoint from the first day that we started building it. and he's going to be doing this directly after this talk. Thank you very much, and have fun with Waypoint.